Philip Ingram is a retired British Army colonel. He was a senior British Army intelligence officer. Welcome to our program, Colonel Ingram.
Nice to be on again. Thank you very much indeed.
North Korea has deployed 50,000 troops to the Kursk region, including the Russian troops and North Korean one, aiming to launch another full-scale attack on the Ukrainian army, also to liberate the Kursk region and to even move deep inside the Russian territory, inside the Ukrainian territory in case of success. Meanwhile, Ukrainian political leadership could be eliminated, according to the former Foreign Affairs Minister of Ukraine. This has been reported by The Economist. What is your take on the current developments in the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's very interesting. The introduction of North Korean troops to fight alongside the Russian troops shows just how much difficulty the Russians are having in recruiting Russians to go and fight on the front lines. Trying to integrate North Koreans, even if you had practiced and exercised with them for many years, would be very difficult given the language barriers and the issues that there are with different tactics and everything else. And therefore, that's why I think they're going to be used first and foremost in the Kursk region to try and see if they can be properly integrated. But I think it is showing desperation by the Russians.
The Washington Post reported about the phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. According to the Washington Post, Donald Trump reminded Putin about the significant military presence of the US troops in Europe and asked Putin not to escalate in this war. However, Kremlin denies the fact of this phone call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. What is your opinion about this?
I find this very, very interesting indeed. And I think, as many of your viewers will know, they'll understand Russian psychology and Russian intelligence psychology behind this. And I think that's critical to understanding what's happened. I suspect there has been a phone call, whether it was directly between President Trump and Vladimir Putin or between those that are working for them. That is not clear, but I suspect what has happened is that Trump's team, as we're seeing, not just with what was reported in his effectively threat to Vladimir Putin, but we're seeing this out of Trump's team in threatening Hamas and other organizations around the world, suggesting that as soon as Trump becomes the 47th president and gets sworn in, then he's going to start to take decisive action. He is saying, his team is saying the same thing to President Zelensky, prepared to negotiate. Otherwise, we're going to cut all your support off. But it was interesting, the Russian response to deny the phone call ever happened. And that came out of Peskov, who is the biggest source of disinformation coming out of Moscow, and is usually the disinformation voice that is put out there whenever he wants the world to think it's serious. And then what happens immediately afterwards, we find that Russian state television starts to broadcast naked pictures of Melania Trump, Donald Trump's wife, whenever she was a model, and puts that all over Russian national television. That, to me, when I'm thinking of it from an intelligence officer's perspective and thinking of it from a Russian intelligence officer's perspective, is a pure threat back from Putin, back to Trump. And that is Putin, I think, saying to Donald Trump, just be careful what you threaten me of, because I may or may not have something that I can embarrass you or threaten you with. And that's, I think, the message that he was sending back again. So, there was definitely some form of phone call, whether it was directly Trump to Putin, probably not, but certainly between their two staffs, and therefore Peskov denying it. I think he's very carefully denying that there wasn't direct conversation between Putin and Trump, but then the threat came back in. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I think Donald Trump's threat to the Russians not to escalate, I don't think Vladimir Putin's going to listen. And therefore, when it comes to, even if Donald Trump's new presidency starts off by trying to force some form of peace negotiations, I don't think the Russians are going to give any ground whatsoever. And therefore, if President Zelensky plays his diplomacy card as well as he has done in the last almost 3 years, then he will allow Vladimir Putin to make all of the mistakes. And therefore, I suspect Donald Trump might come in and use the veiled threat that he has done and allow Ukraine to hit Russia very, very hard several times to force them back to the negotiating table. It will be a very interesting time.
Do you think that Vladimir Putin perceived this kindly reminder from Trump about the military presence in Europe as a threat? That's why he could done this threat. He could do this threat in exchange of threats between Putin and Donald Trump. Do you think that Putin felt himself as a humiliated one after this phone call or exchange of messages between Trump and Putin?
Oh, I have no doubt Putin felt humiliated. I have no doubt that Putin and his team will have done everything to try and ensure that Donald Trump got into the White House, but he didn't have to put much effort in because the Democrats were so bad that they did all the work that was needed for him. But I think Putin, because of the tacit support that there has been and some interesting meetings between him and Donald Trump in the past, probably feels as if he's got some form of relationship there, whether it is a one that he feels he's got some form of control over or not is difficult to assess. But he will have seen or will have taken the wording that the US has got a lot of capability in Europe as a direct threat. And if that was in the opening statements of a new phone call, even if it was between staffs, that will have concerned him. And that's why I think Putin's response was to put naked pictures of Melania Trump all over Russian state television to threaten him back again, because that's what Putin does. But to do it in that way, to make it personal, to use Donald Trump's wife is not just a Russian way of doing things, it's a Russian intelligence way of doing things.
It seems like ugly action from Kremlin, don't you think so?
Oh, very much so. But have we seen anything else out of the Kremlin but ugly action? They've ignored, in their war with Ukraine, it's not a special military operation; it's a war. But they have ignored the rules of war. They're a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations. They're not living up to being on that position on the world stage. They are one of the biggest pariahs in the world at the moment. There are international arrest warrants out for Vladimir Putin and many of those in his regime. This is something that even when the war ends, the implications of what has gone on are not going to end for a long, long time.
From your perspective, do you believe that Donald Trump can reach a ceasefire in Ukraine in the nearest future? The Telegraph reported about the plan, which consists of deployment European, British troops to the front line in Ukraine to ensure the demilitarized zone along the front line between Ukrainian troops and Russian one. Do you believe in such scenario?
Well, it was reported coming out of Donald Trump's team as part of the planning. I think they've been planning for lots of different scenarios. I don't think they talked to the British about this, and I don't think they've talked to other NATO nations formally about this. But the one thing you can guarantee is the only way that this conflict is going to end is by negotiation. War is diplomacy by other means, and war will only finish whenever you go back to proper diplomacy and can sit down and talk. However, the conditions need to be right for the talking to happen. And those conditions, from my perspective, and from, I see, President Zelensky's perspective, are not Russia continuing to hold Ukrainian territory. And if somehow or other that was a forced solution, to my mind, I think that that would potentially stimulate a much larger global conflict, because we've got other despot leaders such as Xi Jinping in China sitting watching to see what will happen. And if Vladimir Putin has got the ability to forcibly take territory that is not his and to keep that territory, and the international community turns a blind eye and lets him do that, as happened with his initial illegal invasion in Crimea in 2014, then Xi Jinping will turn around and work out whether it is worth the international wrath for him to physically capture Taiwan by force. And if he decides to capture Taiwan by force, the Japanese, I think, will try and retake their Kuril Islands that Russia has occupied since 1945 back again, because Russia will be at its weakest. And if that happens, then Kim Jong-un in North Korea may turn around and think that with the world occupied in dealing with what's going on in Taiwan and potentially Japan, and cleaning up with what is happening between a forced peace deal in Russia and Ukraine and what is going on in the Middle East, then that's his best opportunity to try and capture South Korea. And we could see a nuclear weapon being dropped on Seoul. And therefore, the stakes, the global stakes for getting this wrong are huge. And I've been at this game for over 40 years now, looking at global threats. And I've never seen such a clear path to a third world war as I can do now.
But why would Vladimir Putin agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine on any kind of terms if his troops were moving forward on the east of Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, I think his troops are moving forward, but at a huge cost. In the last 24 hours, I think, according to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, he lost 1,950 troops dead or severely wounded. That is unsustainable. He has been losing over 1,500 troops a day through the whole of 2024. And you can measure its unsustainability not by looking at Russian statistics or listening to the comments that are coming out of the Kremlin, but looking at the fact that he's having to actively recruit in Africa, and he's having to actively try and get Kim Jong-un in North Korea to supply troops. And he's just signed a formal defense agreement with Kim Jong-un in North Korea to open the gates to get even more troops. But it's not just the troops that he's short of, it's also vehicles, ammunition, and other weapon systems. And again, he's relying on North Korea to supply him lots of ammunition and weapons. He's relying on China to provide him the technologies. And China is hesitant at doing it because it doesn't want to bring in the wrath of the West if it's seen to overtly supply capability. But the price that Vladimir Putin will be paying for China's tacit support will be enormous. China will be expecting to be given ownership of huge areas of Russia's natural resources, and that will cause diplomatic pressures further down the line. And of course, we've got Russia relying on Iran as well. And from a global perspective, we have to ask, what are North Korea and what are Iran getting from Russia by way of payment and support for what they're giving into Russia? So I don't think Russia has got the ability to sustain the operations it's doing at the moment for any length of time whatsoever. And I think if they're still doing this by early to mid 2025, then they will have just about run out of new manpower and run out of equipment, even the equipment that they're bringing out of storage and elsewhere. So the tide will turn very, very quickly indeed if Russia continues with these losses into next year.
Don't you think that Trump would need to put more pressure on Vladimir Putin to force him to negotiate in good faith, to make some concessions to Ukraine? Because previously Putin said that he would not make any kind of concessions, and the war could be ended only on Russian terms. And all we know, you and me, all we know, what are these Russian terms?
Well, the Russian terms are difficult. I think they've changed. I don't think Putin knows them himself at the moment. It was the complete capitulation of Ukraine with the installation of a puppet government like we see with Lukashenko in Belarus, and therefore Ukraine becoming pro-Russian and moving away from Europe and moving away from NATO. That's never going to happen. So now his changed objective will be the retention of Crimea and the captured territories, or ideally the whole of the disputed Donbass region. As Putin puts it out as disputed, it's not disputed. The international boundaries are very clear. But that's what Putin will be hoping for. Donald Trump will have to put a lot of pressure on Putin, and we will see in the initial weeks and months how much of a hold Putin has over Trump by the statements that Trump is coming out and the additional pressure that he then puts onto President Zelensky. If there's any move towards an unfair settlement in any way, shape or form. But I don't think Putin's going to capitulate. And therefore, Trump will be expecting him to give up something. But Putin's not of the mind to do that. And Putin, I think, is so isolated in his own little cell of people who want to tell him what he wants to hear, and therefore still believes that he is in overall control and can influence things. I think he will just dig his heels in, as we say in the UK, and will not give any ground whatsoever. And that will force Trump's hand to potentially dump his relationship with Putin, if he has one, or what he's trying to do from a fair perspective, and to back President Zelensky with some very real military capability. I think when we get to negotiation, a demilitarized zone is an ideal end at the end of the conflict, but that demilitarized zone should not necessarily be a demilitarized area of territory that Russia occupies inside Ukraine. That demilitarized zone should be inside Russia, within artillery range and rocket range of the Ukrainian borders. And I'm sure the Ukrainian military would quite happily, if there's an international peacekeeping force, turn around and agree to a demilitarized zone along the Russian border, provided there was a proper peace agreement in place with proper troops that were there, making sure that it was being kept secure.
Do you expect a big confrontation, escalation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? As you said, Vladimir Putin would not be ready to any kind of concessions to Ukraine, the United States, because he will just dig in and move forward with his war objectives. And on the other hand, we have Donald Trump, who would try to force Putin to get him to a negotiation table. But if Vladimir Putin refuses to any kind of a normal, appropriate peace deal, would it mean a big confrontation between Trump and Putin?
I can see that coming. I can see it building up. What will happen is there will be increasing tension behind closed doors that we won't see from an international community's perspective. We'll know that that tension is building by the statements that are coming out after people are become aware of Putin's meetings and discussions with Vladimir Putin. We will know the level of control that Putin has or thinks he has over Trump by the statements that will come out of Moscow and from Peskov, but also by the way Trump's behavior may change. But at some stage, that relationship will have to come out into a public environment where I think if Putin will not give any concessions whatsoever, and I don't think he will, then Donald Trump will have to get very angry with him very publicly, and there will be a complete breakdown of relations. Again, that is worrying because Vladimir Putin may turn around and think that the only way out of this would be to start a wider European war or to stimulate conflict going on elsewhere. So he's got a degree of control over Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He might stimulate Kim Jong-un to do something that would take America's focus away elsewhere, which is why I think European nations are getting very worried, because we have three regions of conflict brewing around the world. In Europe with Russia and Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in Southeast Asia. From a global perspective, the most current of biggest threat is Russia in Ukraine and what Russia would do next. But from a longer term perspective, the worst conflict would be a conflict growing in Southeast Asia, because that would have an even bigger impact across the globe. The United States is concerned that the world is trying to expect it to deal with all three regions simultaneously, which is why I think Trump will put an awful lot of pressure onto Europe, onto the European nations within NATO, to try and provide even more support to Ukraine than they're doing at the moment.
Also, we have another developments about the national security team of Donald Trump. So Mike Waltz would becomes the next national security advisor to the Donald Trump. Also, I have read his latest article on the Economist, and he wrote, I will quote, "If Vladimir Putin refuses to talk, Washington can provide more weapons to Ukraine with fewer restrictions on their use, and faces with this pressure, Vladimir Putin will probably take the opportunity to wind the conflict down," according to the latest article of Mike Waltz. Do you agree with this strategy, with this presumption?
I think it's a clear indication of what I've been saying so far. Mike Waltz is, on one hand issuing a big threat, on the other hand, suggesting a solution. And whenever you're in diplomatic negotiations, you never leave yourself in a position where you're not giving the other side a way out, a way of doing things. So Mike Waltz has very cleverly told Vladimir Putin what to do. If Putin doesn't do it, he said what will happen. Now, we'll see that more and more as Donald Trump's team starts to settle in and prepare to take over the White House. And then once the inauguration has happened, I think we'll see this coming in very quickly indeed. Of course, we've seen exactly the same tactics come out of his new Secretary of State, where he was talking about the situation in the Middle East, where he turned around to Hamas and threatened them and said, release the hostages and release the hostages now. If they're not released by the time Donald Trump becomes the 47th president, then we will take our the gloves off even more. So we're seeing this threatening behavior happening in each of the conflicts around the world. That will keep Xi Jinping worried, so he will not do anything to impact Taiwan in the near future. But I think, on balance, if I was Vladimir Putin and thinking logically, which Putin doesn't do, I'd be very worried. If I was President Zelensky, knowing that I know how to be a diplomat on the international stage and to be cooperative and to win people over, I'd be quite happy if he continues to do that. So I don't see Donald Trump coming in as being as bad as people may have predicted.
Does it mean that Donald Trump would be the worst case, the worst president for Vladimir Putin rather than Kamala Harris, for example?
Well, I think Kamala Harris will have continued the policies of Joe Biden, and those policies were heavily influenced by internal domestic U.S. politics, and the real differences there were between the Republican Party and her Democratic Party. We saw that whenever the leader of the House held up the $60+ billion aid package going to Ukraine over a domestic issue with regard to the border in Mexico for almost 6 months. And we saw the impact that had with the thousands of Ukrainian lives that were lost because of an internal domestic political dispute inside the United States, which was disgusting. Kamala Harris would have continued to do the same. So the one thing I think we'll get out of Donald Trump is greater decisiveness. I think we were scared that that decisiveness would be pro-Putin against Ukraine. I thought that myself initially, especially after Donald Trump left the presidency beforehand and watching him. But I think over the last year or so, I've been looking at it in more detail, and I think, as you say, it could be the other way around. Donald Trump's presidency could be the worst thing that is ever going to happen to Vladimir Putin.
Also, European leaders are trying to work out whether they can keep Ukraine's war effort going if Donald Trump decides to stop sending aid to Ukraine. According to Bloomberg, can European countries really replace American aid for Ukraine, military one?
I don't think European countries can replace US military aid to Ukraine. But what it can do is it can increase its support and give probably just enough to enable Ukraine to continue to defend against Russian aggression. And if European nations actually increase their military production capability, which there's a debate going on, and President Trump may force European nations to do that. We've heard him, or we saw him in his last presidency, put pressure on NATO nations to make sure they were paying a minimum of 2% of their GDP to NATO, to their defense side, to meet their NATO commitment. Many nations weren't doing that, and after he threatened them, many nations got up to that 2%. He may turn around and say 3%, and if he forces European nations to increase their defense budgets, then that would increase the ability of those nations to provide support to Ukraine. So I can see the potential for European support to increase, but can it replace in the short term or medium term? No.
How do you see Donald Trump's stance on NATO? Can he and will he withdraw from NATO from your perspective?
I don't think it'll withdraw from NATO. NATO is a defensive military alliance, but there's also a lot of political kudos that comes from it, and America leads it at the minute. The Supreme Allied Commander is always an American officer, because that gives him influence into Europe, and it gives the United States strong political influence into Europe as well, and allows him to keep his northern border under a bit more control and put pressure on them. Of course, we've got Canada as NATO, and Canada is one of the countries that is not meeting its signed up commitment of 2% of GDP to its defense forces. And I think Donald Trump will put more pressure on them. I think Trump will increase the pressure on NATO countries to increase their defense spending, and will be very blunt and aggressive in doing so. But he approaches things from a businessman's perspective, not from a diplomat's perspective. So he's used to forcing his hand in business and using threats to get what he wants. So we'll see more of that. But I think NATO is pretty secure, because what he would want is NATO to do exactly what it says on the tin, North Atlantic, and to start to look after North Atlantic security, allowing the United States potentially to pivot further into Southeast Asia to look at the growing problems that there are there, and also to try and bring greater stability into the Middle East, because that has got a massive impact on the US economy as well as the global economy.
What would it take for Donald Trump and European leaders to force Vladimir Putin to a negotiations table from a military point of view? What are the most tough options for Donald Trump in case of a big confrontation between Trump and Vladimir Putin, and in case of the political will of Donald Trump to put more pressure on Putin to force him to negotiate with Ukraine and end this war on just terms, at least appropriate terms for Ukraine?
Well, I think the bravest thing that the international community could do to support Ukraine would be, first and foremost, to remove any restrictions on use of any weapons inside Russian territory at all, and to increase the supply of long-range weapons, to enhance the very real capabilities that Ukraine is developing and fielding with the long-range UAVs. It's attacking Russian targets with great success. But if it got longer range Western weapons, that would give Ukraine the ability to disrupt Russian activities that are coming in to support its actions into Ukraine. And the second thing, and I think this would be extremely brave, but it ties in with a lot of discussions that are going on at the moment, would be potentially to move NATO troops into Ukraine to secure the borders with Belarus, to secure the eastern part of Ukraine, to create a secure area for Ukraine's defense industrial base to thrive, secure areas for military capability, military training to go on, and allow the Ukrainian military then to focus purely on pushing Vladimir Putin out from the illegally captured territories in the east of Ukraine. And NATO could potentially provide more of a marine and naval capability for Ukraine to operate as it would then plan operations to retake Crimea. But that would be very brave, because that would be very much throwing the gauntlet down to Vladimir Putin and cross more than just his red lines, cross the line of an existential threat to Russia, and that could potentially stimulate the use of nuclear weapons, which is something that NATO countries are very concerned about and would be even more concerned about.
According to The Guardian, relations between Ukraine and the United Kingdom have worsened since Labour won the general election, and the big issue of this is authorization to use long-range weapons inside Russia and providing Ukraine with more Storm Shadow missiles. What is your reaction to this?
Well, we saw it when Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister. He turned around, and when the international community was not providing main battle tanks to Ukraine because Vladimir Putin had said that was a red line and he would consider using nuclear weapons, Boris Johnson turned around and provided the first 12 or 14 main battle tanks. The UK can't provide much equipment, but that political move to do that broke the impasse. I think if Boris Johnson was still the Prime Minister, then Storm Shadow, the restrictions on the use of Storm Shadow would have disappeared overnight. Ukraine would be allowed to use them, and Boris Johnson would have turned around to the Americans and gone, "Hey, I've allowed it to be used. There hasn't been a problem. Let's just get on with it." And Francois Macron in France would have agreed with Boris Johnson doing that. The fact that Keir Starmer isn't being as bold politically when it comes to forcing the hand of the rest of the international community, and he doesn't seem to be doing very much apart from just making statements about giving levels of support. That to me suggests that the level of support coming out of the United Kingdom has gone backwards since the new Labour government has come in. They're not making very many decisions, however, in the UK as well. So I don't think this is specifically related to a relationship with Ukraine. I think this is our new Labour government in relationship to everything that they're trying to make decisions on. They're not doing well at the moment from a populist perspective.
Also, Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's former chief of staff, has been appointed to as a new national security advisor to the UK Prime Minister. Don't you think that this appointment of Jonathan Powell as a national security advisor could be a reason of such weak support for Ukraine, not bold as it was during Boris Johnson's time in the office?
Yeah, it is. And here's where I'm going to make a very personal statement, because this is my personal belief. Jonathan Powell in that position is a joke. It is an appallingly bad appointment. Anyone associated with Tony Blair's government being appointed into this government shows that the new government in the UK just does not understand diplomacy. It does not understand the issues that there are within our own country and how to deal with issues from an international perspective. And that can only be a bad thing for Europe, a bad thing for our relationship with Ukraine, a bad thing for our relationship with the United States. The UK is not in a good position at the moment.
And my last question for you would be about the next policy of Donald Trump. What do you expect from Donald Trump regarding his policy towards the Middle East, the war in Gaza, towards the Korean Peninsula, tensions between North and South Korea, and towards the situation regarding Taiwan?
Yeah, well, I think with regard to the Middle East, we've already started to see some of his policy coming out where Senator Rubio, who's going to be his next Secretary of State, has directly threatened Hamas. I think there will be, we'll see statements in the coming days or weeks of direct threats to Iran if they continue to support Hezbollah and other terror organizations across the Middle East. Direct threats into the Houthis as well. So Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel celebrated Donald Trump coming in because he sees him as a friend. And I think all of the Iranian-backed militias operating across the Middle East will be, or should be, concerned now because Donald Trump, when he was last president, he kept saying that there weren't any wars during his time. There were more UAV strikes, assassinating senior people in different organizations than during any other presidency. And again, we'll see similar tactics down into Southeast Asia. So I can see Donald Trump reaching out a sort of hand of friendship to Kim Jong-un in North Korea and saying, talk and negotiate, give up your support for Russia. And we will help North Korea develop economically. But please don't threaten South Korea. At the same time, he will reach out quite firmly to Xi Jinping and threaten him if he tries to take Taiwan by force. There has never been a good relationship between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. So the United States has got a global issue with Trump coming in that it's having to focus on. So I think that's why we will see him trying to push European nations to provide more support into Ukraine, rather than the US have to take on three different areas of responsibility as the lead for all of them. It would rather only have two and be supporting in the third. And therefore, US support in Europe in the fight that Ukraine has got to push Russia back, I think will stay, but it will dial back whenever European support is raised up. So we're in for an interesting time, I think.
Does it mean that we are closer to the global conflict rather than ever before?
There's a simple answer to that, yes. The uncertainty that Donald Trump brings in makes the world much more unstable. That uncertainty also, in some ways, will make the decisions by the likes of Xi Jinping and all the rest of it push them off. So it'll bring an element of stability. So I'm sort of contradicting myself here slightly, but that's what intelligence officers do, and it's important that we do contradict our own thinking. Whenever Trump gets in, if he goes in for an aggressive stance, we are getting closer and closer and closer to a global conflict. We are at the moment. It's going to need someone of his sort of character, I think, to try and push us away from it, because I think if Kamala Harris had been in, we would slowly have drifted towards a global conflict, and I think it would have been a certainty.
But only with even maybe weaker position, don't you think so?
Oh, very much weaker position, yes. She was weakening the US military. NATO resolve was being weakened. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping were continuing to fracture international relations through information operations and operations in the grey zone with their intelligence services, and would have continued to do that until they decided it was a point where the international community had less ability to come together and react to whatever they did. At the same time, we were seeing a strengthening of what people refer to as this axis of evil: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and that growing relationship is very worrying indeed.
Thank you, Colonel Ingram, for your time, for your insights and supporting for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini. Thank you.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.
50,000 Russian and North Korean troops massed ahead of attack. Why situation on battlefield complicated and generally getting worse, and how Putin reacts on large-scale drone attack on Moscow. We will talk about this with Julian Röpcke, senior political editor at BILD. Julian, glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The New York Times has reported that 50,000 Russian and North Korean soldiers are preparing to launch a large-scale counteroffensive in Russia's Kursk region. According to U.S. officials, Russian troops are carrying out missile strikes on Ukrainian positions in Kursk region and deploying artillery against them, but they have not yet launched a large-scale offensive. What about your expectations? How do you think whether the North Korean government will authorize its troops to conduct long-term operations in Ukraine, or whether they are intended only for a counteroffensive in Kursk region?
Well, I think let's start with the situation in Kursk. As you mentioned, there are numerous reports of many thousand Russian as well as Korean soldiers being ready for deployment. I think I'm always a little bit skeptical when it comes to numbers. I think we have seen very good information from the 95th Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, who have been defending Malaya Logna area over the last 3 days or 4 days against the 810th Marine Brigade of the Russian Federation. And they have been very successful. They say 28 Russian armored fighting vehicles, mainly BTR-82A, which is a very modern fighting vehicle, have been destroyed, and 100 soldiers killed and 100 wounded from the Russian Federation. So I think that is realistic. When we see counteroffensives from the Russian side, as we have seen 4 weeks ago, I think, from Koronevo, it has also been 10 tanks. Now we have 28 tanks, so maybe 30 tanks. So, but this is always a company size, not even a brigade size. So yes, it is possible that we have 50,000 soldiers there all together in Kursk being stationed and deployed. But I think when it comes to real counterattacks, you have to see that there are only a couple of roads, a couple of possibilities. You have seen this in the footage that as soon as they encountered a lake, for example, the Russians had to withdraw because one vehicle was destroyed and the other ones couldn't pass by because there was a forest or a lake. So I think what we have seen over the past 3 days, this is realistically what we can expect from the Russians. So when it comes to counteroffensive, this means you have maybe on a big day, you have 300, 400, 500 soldiers involved, but not 50,000 at one point, of course. On the other hand, you were asking about the North Koreans. I think, as so many others before, the North Koreans will be tricked into fighting. We have heard this from many, I remember last year, I think it was some Gazprom private army. They said they should guard something. Instead, they were sent to the meat grinder. We have heard this from Wagner troops. We have heard this from Mobilized, that they were always used much more offensive than what they were told by the Russian government. And I think the same is true for North Korean soldiers. I think they will tell them you are on the rear, you are on the backside, you will only defend. But I think in reality, we will see some of them at least being used on the battlefield against Ukrainian troops, either in Kursk or Oblast. I think this is the most likely version, or maybe even later in Ukraine.
Julian, if we're talking about a station in Ukraine, Alexander Syrsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, has said that the situation on the battlefield is tending to get worse. The situation remains difficult and is tending to escalate. The enemy, using their numerical superiority, continues to conduct offensive actions and is focusing their main efforts on the Pokrovsk and Kurakhove fronts. How do you think, is Ukrainian front at risk of collapsing?
Well, I think the risk is always there. However, so far we are not seeing the whole front collapsing. I mean, we have a long front in Zaporizhzhia, for example, in the south, which is very, very stable from the Ukrainian side. We have also a large part of the front, I think, in Toretsk area, which is quite stable. You can see not only within the town, but also to the north and south. When it comes to Chasiv Yar, this is stable. When it comes to New York, this is stable. But as you rightfully mentioned, there are a couple of places, especially the area between, I would say, Pokrovsk down to Vuhledar. So that's 100 length of a front where the Russian army is very strong, is very much pressing, and is also having a tactical success, I would say, at least. They have been capturing around, I think, almost 250 square kilometers over the past, let's say, 3 weeks, and they keep advancing. As you know, Seledovo was captured, Vuhledar was captured, and right now we are seeing the threat of Kurakhove being captured as well. And just as in the other towns, it is not likely to be a frontal attack. So they are not going all in. They're trying this as well. But you saw that I think the 46th Brigade there is defending very much, and they're destroying lots of Russian tanks going from Maximilievka to Kurakhove on the direct road. But at the same time, and this is the big problem, they are flanking the Ukrainian army. So they are coming from the south, and they have been close to a number of villages there. And also in Sontsivka, we have seen at least Ukrainian tank fire within the town. So this would mean that they already bypassed Kurakhove in the north and in the south. And this, of course, makes the tactical situation for the soldiers, I think many thousand soldiers in and around Kurakhove, very, very dangerous. If you see that the Russians already passed their positions, they are west of their positions, north and south. So in the end, I fear once again the Ukrainian army has to decide whether or not they want to risk encirclement and fight in an encircled town. I think they don't want this. Or the alternative would be to withdraw the forces in time to the west and then And then unfortunately Russia would take another town. I think 18,000 inhabitants have been in Kurachovo last time I've been there in September. And it's a crazy situation, unfortunately. And of course, if you look at what's happening in the result, it's not a collapse of the army. It doesn't mean the Ukrainian army stops to exist or runs away, but it means again that another town, another 20 villages around, and another 200, 300 square kilometers fall to the Russian army. And of course, if you look territorial-wise at it, this looks at least a regional collapse.
Julian, I see the message that on the morning of November 11, Russian troops shelled Kurachovo in the Donetsk region. As a result, the Staroy dam of the Kurachovo reservoir was destroyed, according to Donbas News and Suspilne Donbas. According to Donbas News sources, the water in the Volcha River has risen by 1 meter so far. In the villages along the river, the water is rising. And also, I see that Roman Pedun, head of the Kurachovo City Military Administration, tells Suspilne, quote, "We know that water is flowing through the villages located near the Staroy dam. We can't confirm the nature of the damage or its severity. We can't inspect the dam because of the constant Russian shelling as of now." What do you think about this?
Yes, I myself used this dam and used the road on it in mid-September several times. And during the time, it was like it was a gamble to go over it, because in the morning and in the evening, the Russian army was shelling the dam. It was bombing it with FAB 500 bombs. And it was really a crazy situation. When we drove over the dam in the morning, there was little damage. And when we drove in the afternoon, there was much more damage. So I can at least tell you that the Russian army has been trying to destroy this dam because it's an important supply route for Kurachovo. There's only one route to the west, to Andriivka, and before, I think, Dachne is the first village. And this is the one going to Beretsky and Ilinka in the north. And as you know, the Russian army has been capturing Ilinka, and they are very, very close to getting Beretsky. So, of course, I don't know who destroyed the dam right now. I would say the Russians tried in the past very often, but I would also see tactical advances if the Ukrainian army would destroy it, because if the Russians are indeed very close to Sontsivka and very close to Beretsky, then they are very close of capturing the whole northern shore of the Kurachovo reservoir. And in this case, of course, you would have to destroy the dam, to not have the Russians closing the dam and attacking Kurachovo itself from the northwest, which would be really dangerous. I think the flooding, it is not so big. There are not many villages to the west of the reservoir. There are more villages to the east. So I think, and many people already fled the Russian shelling and fled the Russian offensive there. So I think the danger to civilians isn't that big because of the destruction, but of course, the possibility to use the dam as a supply route is now gone. It's now forever gone. I think no one can repair this under shelling. So whoever wants to cross this dam road now, and it's important to reach Kurachovo itself, will have a big problem.
Julian, you know, the inspection of the Russian strike site is complicated due to active fighting in the Pokrovsk and Kurachovo directions. Yes. And depending on the degree of damage to the dam, there is a risk of partial flooding of settlements located downstream of the Volcha River and a lot of villages. If we're talking about also the Zaporizhzhia region, the defense forces are holding back the advance of the Russian occupying army in the Donetsk region and the southern part of the Zaporizhzhia region. Can we say that the Russian occupying army is preparing for new assault actions in the Orikhiv and Robotino directions in the Zaporizhzhia region to take logistical routes to the east under fire control?
Well, I think the Ukrainian army has been preparing for an assault from the south. You know, last year's counteroffensive, unfortunately, didn't really work well. It didn't even reach Tokmak and not Melitopol and not the other towns in the area. But on the same side, or at the same time, I think the Ukrainian defense is very strong to the south in Zaporizhzhia. So the Russians, I would say, choose another road. They choose to attack Zaporizhzhia region from the east. And as you know, they are quite close to Velika Novosilka, which is part of the strong southern defense, but they're coming from the east. And there, I think, have been several reports of new trench lines, new defense lines being prepared near and within Zaporizhzhia region. So I do not expect another big offensive from the south, but I expect them coming from the from the east, from Donetsk Oblast. And as you know, it is only a couple of kilometers until the Oblast border to Zaporizhia, and also only 21 kilometers left to the Oblast border from Dnipro from the east. So I think the Russians are aiming at these Oblast borders. And I think everyone in Ukraine knows that you can never believe what Putin says. So no one thinks the Russians will stop at the Oblast border. They think, and the Ukrainian army is therefore preparing defenses of Pavlograd and other towns. I've seen this with my own eyes. They are preparing defense lines there because they know if the Russians reach the Oblast border, they will also cross it and they will try to get more of Ukraine. And this is why the battle for Donetsk is also a battle of whole of Ukraine.
October 2024 saw Russian forces suffer the most considerable monthly losses since the start of the full-scale invasion. Reported by Sir Tony Radakin, UK Chief of the Defense Staff, Radakin noted that Russian forces had suffered an average of around 1,500 casualties per day in October, both killed and wounded. He added that Russia's total losses are nearing 700,000 since the invasion began in February 2022. Do you agree that the Russian military almost certainly cannot indefinitely sustain a daily casualty rate of over 1,200 people as long as Putin remains committed to avoiding another involuntary collapse of reservists? Even an involuntary reserve mobilization will not resolve the larger problem Putin apparently faces in finding enough people to work in Russia's industries while also feeding the front.
Well, I think there are several aspects to the answer. First, I have to say again, I am skeptical towards these numbers. I'm very skeptical. As you know, I have visited the front line myself several times, altogether more than 12 times when it comes to the 2014 invasion, where Russia started attacking, and twice during this war. And I've been with units of the Ukrainian army, for example, with Karadak, who said that in the Pokrovsk area, they are killing and wounding around 100 to 200 on a very good day for them. For them, it was 200 Russian soldiers they killed per day. Also yesterday, we heard the 95th Brigade saying in the 2 days, they destroyed 28 Russian armored vehicles and killed 100 soldiers. So I think this is realistic numbers. We have to see realistic numbers that Russia is probably right now losing between 200, 300, maybe sometimes 400 soldiers per day. This is, I think, the absolute maximum. And if you see how Russians are treating their fallen, they're injured, they're not evacuating them. So they're not bringing them back. As Ukrainians rightfully say, for Russians, this is a one-way ticket to go to this to Ukraine, because there's just no infrastructure, no logistics, no idea to medevac them. So I would say we have around twice as many injured as we have the killed. So in this case, well, maybe we have 700 Russian casualties per day, killed and wounded. And I think it makes much more sense if you see these numbers, not only if you talk to Ukrainian soldiers, which will never tell you we killed 1,000 Russians yesterday, but also if you see the numbers Russia is mobilizing. They cannot mobilize a new brigade every 2 days. This is impossible. Russia cannot mobilize 3,000 new soldiers after 2 days because Ukraine says they killed and wounded 3,000 soldiers in 2 days. I think the numbers are much smaller, unfortunately. From this, you were asking if it needs a new mobilization for Putin. I think right now it is enough to let Russians fight and kill for money. You know, the circumstances in Russia are really bad. This is a fascist regime. They are having so much propaganda, and they have so bad circumstances for the people that 1,500 euros a month, which is like triple of what Russians normally get as a salary per month, and with the promise of getting even a little more money for their family, or a larder or some fruits or whatever to a little village if they die in Ukraine. I think this is right now, it seems unfortunately enough for Russian people to go to Ukraine and to commit war crimes and also to risk their own lives. We have this talk for a very long time if there is another official mobilization, but I think right now the Russian regime is mobilizing enough people with money and propaganda to go to Ukraine and die for nothing.
Julian, about war crimes, about horrible things, Ukrainian officials continue to speak of execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war by the Russians. The Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office announced on the 9th of November that it was investigating a video showing Russian forces executing a captured an unarmed Ukrainian soldier in violation of the Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War. Ukrainian Ombudsman Dmytro Lubinets mentioned that he sent a letter to the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross regarding the war crime reports. These actions must not go unpunished, and the enemy must be held fully accountable. Russia is a terrorist state that violates all the rules and customs of war. The international community must not turn a blind eye to such crimes, but international community turn a blind eye now. Agree?
Yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, killing Ukrainian prisoners of war becomes the new normal with the Russian war, unfortunately. I think for several reasons. Sometimes, as bitter as it sounds, sometimes it's practical reasons. Russians don't have a way back. They have no infrastructure to go back in Pokrovsk area, for example. So this is a one-way ticket for them. So how should they create a ticket for Ukrainian soldiers? It's no excuse. It's still a war crime. But I'm just saying sometimes it's very practical reasons for them. They don't know what to do with prisoners of war because there's no logistics to bring them back to the prisons or whatever. And sometimes, and very often, it is because of ideological reasons, because of hatred. We have seen this just a couple of days ago when they claimed someone is not Ukrainian, for example, and then killed him because they said no foreign fighters or something like this. Or if they make prisoners of war in Kursk, we have seen them really bad treating these people because and allegedly they were attacking Russia, while we are seeing this is just a defensive operation from Ukraine, a direct reply to the Russian invasion. So I think it's a new normal. It's an absolute outrage. It's a war crime. It's nothing someone in Russia is afraid about. And you were absolutely right. I see no echo from the European side, from the American side. I've been complaining about this before when there is just a report from the Middle East, for example, that someone killed someone involuntarily, or there was an accident or some collateral damage. The German establishment, especially the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they are complaining about this. They're having their own communiques about this. They talk about this very much. And this happens every day in Ukraine. Russia's doing this every day. So I don't see a verbal reaction. No one is commenting on this. And not to speak of new sanctions, because this is what it really would need. You would say that, and I'm happy that our probable next chancellor, when it comes to the polls, Friedrich Merz said this: you have to tell the Russians, if you do this, we do that. If you go further, if you keep attacking Ukrainian infrastructure, if you keep killing Ukrainian prisoners of war, we will escalate as well. We will come to your terms, and we will make the price even higher for you. Unfortunately, we are not seeing this so far. We are not seeing that the West reacts to these Russian atrocities. We are just seeing more of the same level of support, which is will probably even go down soon. And this does not really help Ukraine.
I also see in you message about war crime that Russians suspected of executing at least 2 Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk region. So every day, every night, Russian unleashes the same terror. More and more civilian objects are being targeted. Russia only wants to continue the war, and each of its strikes negates any claims of diplomacy from Russia. Russian forces attacked the city of Kryvyi Rih with a ballistic missile and hit a 5-story building on the 11th of November. The rescue operation continues. There may be people underneath the rubble. Russia kills us every day. Why there are no reaction from our partners? What can stop Russian terrorist attacks on Ukraine, if we're talking about bombs, about rockets, and so on?
Yeah. I mean, there are many practical steps we could take as the West. I mean, we could give Ukraine the allowance, the permission to strike Russian airfields with a few weapons it has from us. We have heard from Mr. Zelensky today that France and Great Britain are preparing to send more Storm Shadow cruise missiles, but as you know, they are GPS based, and the Russians are very well in jamming them. And we have unfortunately seen this in the past, which is one of the reasons why I think these missiles have not, cruise missiles have not been used to attack the Crimea bridge when it was still necessary. Right now, as you know, we have other supply routes to Crimea, unfortunately, to occupy Crimea. So I think there are lots of practical steps. The permissions, you could give new weapons. I don't understand why the Americans are not giving any of their 60 in US deployed Patriot batteries to Ukraine. I don't understand this. At the same time, also when it comes to these Russian planes throwing the glide bombs, and I think glide bombs is an euphemism here because these bombs are guided. They're guided glide bombs. They hit their target within only 10-meter accuracy. So we could do a lot against these systems. We could give Ukraine more weapons systems, Patriot systems, and especially more rockets or missiles. I think this is also important because it also doesn't help Ukraine if you give them not 5 but 7 systems, but only 10 missiles per month. So what does this help? I'm not sure. The same about IRIS-T. You know, it's a shorter range system. We're giving more IRIS-T systems to Ukraine, but as far as I am informed, we are still giving the same weekly and monthly numbers since which we gave last year, because we just say we cannot increase the production, which I think is a sort of excuse. So yes, we could do a lot. We could help Ukraine a lot. I don't understand why we don't do more. I think it would be in our interest because everyone agrees that as soon as Russia sort of defeats Ukraine in its terms, whatever this means, this doesn't mean Kiev falls, but it means Russia is satisfied with what is done in Ukraine. I think we all agree that Russia will go to the next country and they will attack the next country, which might be a NATO country, and then we have a much bigger war. So I think it would be in our interest to stop Russia where it is right now. I cannot answer the question why we are not doing this.
Julian, you said about Storm Shadow, about missiles, and the leader of France and the UK are expected to meet in Paris on November 11th. I think that they met to discuss a last-ditch attempt to persuade the US to allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with Western weapons before Donald Trump enters the White House in January. The Telegraph reported citing UK government sources. So should we hope President Joe Biden will give the approval sought by Kiev for a month as a step towards cementing his foreign policy legacy, in your opinion?
Well, to be honest, I think it's too late for this because first, Ukraine does not have enough cruise missiles to do sufficient damage. Second, I said about the electronic warfare capabilities Russia built against the Storm Shadow, and that's exactly the problem. We're giving Russia so much time, so many months to adapt, to learn, to study our weapons, and then just as we realize our weapons are not effective anymore as they should be, we give another weapon, maybe a Leopard 2 or something like this. So this really helped Russia. This to be able to see what the West is doing and to be able to always get used to what it's doing. At the same time, you may not forget that even if President Biden agrees, we need a couple of weeks to get the missiles into Ukraine. We need the information about the airfields. I mean, it doesn't help if you have the missiles and the allowance if you don't have the information. It doesn't help if you hit an empty runway or empty taxiway. You would have to hit the bomber on the ground, the Tu-95. So you need timely information about when the aircraft are where and where you can do the damage. And at the same time, and last but not least, what about after January 20? I mean, even if Ukraine gets the permission now, and if it gets the weapons, and if it gets information, Russia knows that it only has to wait for not even 2 months until the next president will probably rewind everything, will stop all the allowances, and will go for a deal between the Ukrainian government and Russia. And I think this is just too late until the next US administration continues this policy and gives even more of the factors I just said. So more missiles, I mean, attack missiles with a range of 360 kilometers, not just 150, more information, and also convinces, for example, Germany, which would be a very good thing, to finally give the Taurus cruise missile, because these cruise missiles are really strong. They are not vulnerable so much to electronic warfare, so they could be not a game changer, but they could really reduce the Russian air fleet within a couple of weeks if they were used with the right information.
Julian, we are waiting for Taurus and also waiting for Storm Shadow and Scalp. And about what is happening in Russia, Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, DIU, has reported that a Russian army Mi-24 attack helicopter has been destroyed by fire in Moscow region. A Russian attack helicopter was destroyed on the night of the 9th to 10th of November at the Clean-fired airfield in Moscow region. It is reported that the burnt helicopter belonged to the 92nd Special Purpose Instructor. and Research Helicopter Squadron of the 344th Center for Combat Use and Retraining of Flight Personnel of the Russian Armed Forces. How would you rate such special operation by DRU?
Well, I would say, firstly, according to international law, Ukraine has all right to carry Russia's war back into Russia. I think that's the first thing we have to know. So a Ukrainian drone going towards Moscow or Saratov is just as legal as Ukrainian soldiers or special operation officers working in Russia and trying to minimize as much as possible the Russian war machinery. So, of course, these operations might be useful. They might also be symbolic, you have to say, because I don't know how many Mi-8 or Mi-17 Russia has. I think it might be some 100 of them. And we have seen this in the past when we thought, after so many T-90M were destroyed or captured, we always thought, okay, this might be a turning point. So at some point, we were all hoping, you remember, when they first used T-90, T-80, T-72, T-64, T-62, and then even T-54, I think we have seen, we all hope that this is the end. But unfortunately, it's more complex than this. Russia always has old stocks, which are just for kamikaze attacks and killing their own inmates or former prison inmates, but they also have a steady resupply of new forces. So when it comes, for example, to modern tanks or to modern APC, you can just see this in Kursk. I think there was a report of 30 BTR-82A supplied to the 810th just for this assault. So they are producing a lot of new material at the same time, also refurbishing older material so it can stand up to the 2024 standards. But still, of course, every of these attacks is important because it gives the Ukrainian population hope, I would say, that you're not helpless and they're not just waiting for the next attack and waiting for the next cruise missile, but you're also trying to defend yourself and show Russia that what it does will have an effect on its soil.
You remembered about the attack on Moscow, and really on the morning of the 10th of November, Russia's defense ministry has claimed it has shot down 70 Ukrainian aircraft-type UAVs, over 30 of which were heading towards Moscow. As usual, the Russians claimed that they had shot down all the drones, including 34 UAVs over the territory of Moscow region. How do you think, how does such attacks on Moscow can affect on Putin and on Russian people?
Well, I think if these attacks indeed reach Moscow, and they didn't this time, because otherwise we would have seen this, there are always dozens of people showing up their mobiles to the sky and just filming what's happening. We have seen this in the Moscow region where they actually flew. I think if they can hit any strategic target, or at least symbolic target, we have seen the Kremlin being hit more than, I think, a year ago. And I think we all know why this is not happening again, not because Ukraine cannot, but because Ukraine may not. I think this is consensus that someone said, don't do this again. I think if this would happen, this would have quite a good effect on the public in Russia, seeing that it's not just a special military operation somewhere in the West, but it's a war which is coming to our homes and which is affecting our society. At the same time, again, I think these numbers are highly inflated. We have seen the material. We have seen, I think, maybe 3 or 4 of these UT drones, as I call them, small Bayraktar, because they look a little bit like this, but they're smaller. We have seen them over Moscow region, and we have, I think, 2 of them being shot down and then crushed also into residential areas. So I don't know if this is quite useful. I mean, it still shows the Russians, ordinary people, that the war they are supporting, or at least not objecting, is coming back to their homes. At the same time, of course, there's no strategic value by having a little drone which gets shot down and then hits some residential area. There is a strategic value to hit Engels Air Base, for example, or there is a strategic value to hit oil and gas infrastructure. But this special attack, I think yesterday or the day before, I think this was more of a symbolic kind.
You know, Julian, we are waiting for more attacks on Russia. And first of all, I thank you for this interesting conversation. I thank you for supporting our country. Please, guys, subscribe on our YouTube channel, like this video, and see you. I need to say that Julian Röpcke, senior political editor at BILD, was with us today. So good luck and see you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Bye-bye.